great pleasure to introduce Mathias Shulze, who's here from the University of Waterloo in Canada. He's a professor of German and an applied linguist with expertise in computer-assisted language learning. He started his studies at a teacher training college in Leipzig and was trained as a teacher for German and Russian, and went on to earn a PhD from the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology with a dissertation about computer-assisted language learning, and has many publications in that field. And he's also has been since 2011 the editor of the Calico Journal, which some of you may know.
Great. Thank you very much.
Should I start it up?
Yes, please. Just hit the cursor key or something. Well, cryptic title. We've all looked at this now. Should be, yeah, should just move to the next slide, and from then on, should move automatically. Well, as Christine just said, by training, I'm a language teacher, and I guess I became a language teacher because probably from a fairly young age. I was 9 when I started learning Russian at school. I've been fascinated by kind of foreign languages and in parts also language learning. The part that has always, in a way, kind of interested me most, and in terms of my research, which is what you asked me to talk about, is also the area where I think I can make the most useful contribution. Is kind of the second language development, and is particularly the development of proficiency. Now, as we all know, language learning, second language development as a whole has many other facets, and I'm not making any claims whatsoever which one is kind of more or less important or anything. That happens to be the one I am interested in, and where I think useful contributions can be made. Now, how am I doing this? And I've been doing this, well, for the last about 10 years, a bit less than 10 years actually, that I became interested in this particular research program. I became really interested in these complex adaptive systems. They come out with many different labels. I'm pretty sure you'll have heard some of them. In the 1980s, the first and very kind of prominent one was chaos theory. Gleich, this book on chaos theory, and that really was not just a very popular book, it led to a proliferation of studies using this, and it's really a new research paradigm. It's a different way of thinking and approaching research problems in many different areas. Another person who's kind of fairly famous in this context is Lawrence. He's the one with the butterfly effect. He was in meteorology, understanding the weather as a complex system, and I'm sure we can all agree that the weather is a complex system. Oops, can you go back? This one was should want to spend a little more time on this one. Great. Other labels that get used, kind of complexity theory, that's pretty much done in ecology and biology very often. Dynamic systems theory, that's very much done in kind of physics, but also in computer science. And then we already kind of move a little bit closer to areas of language learning, computer-assisted language learning. Most of those approaches in the natural sciences, computer science, engineering, are very heavily mathematical based. And it's a kind of math where basically at the latest on page 4, I tend to give up. It is the kind of mathematics where mathematicians quite honestly say, well, this would require equations with more than 4 variables, and we cannot solve them yet. We're hoping to do that, but so how do we do that? We use a qualitative approach. Still, there are a couple of numbers in there because it needs to be formal enough for a computer, but it's pretty much a very much qualitative approach to this empirical research based on this theoretical paradigm. Now, this complex system theory doesn't really tell us anything about what the different components of the different systems are. It tells you how systems in general work. So we also need another theory in this kind of research, which is about learning, is about development, is about the mind, is about languages in some way. And that is activity theory. And that's basically a theory that, well, started developing in the kind of 1920s, 1930s in the Soviet Union. It was also in North America. It was very much known for a while as Soviet psychology. There was even a journal called Soviet Psychology. Kind of fascinating things happened. Well, and one of the main proponents is Vygotsky, who was basically the kind of Mozart of psychology. He also died as young as Mozart, but extremely influential. A lot of work on literature and culture. Vygotsky was very interested in kind of aesthetics, in understanding how creative art, and he was mainly being Russian, he was interested in Dostoevsky pretty much, how these literary works work, what they do in the mind. So this whole activity theory is basically a theory of mind in some way. Then, not only as an applied linguist, also as a kind of, person, basically. It's one of my strongly held beliefs that at the core of everything we do is language. So it doesn't matter whether we do literature, cultural studies, anything in applied linguistics, language teaching, we cannot do it properly to the kind of greatest level of success, in my opinion, if we don't have a good conceptualization of language, a good understanding of how language works, what it does, what the individual words do, what the whole text does, how texts are created, how they function in different ways, how we interact with one another in communication, all those things. Now, I happen to approach this from a very cognitive angle, as in cognitive linguistics. Cognitive linguistics basically is a kind of counter-argument in parts to Chomskyan linguistics in a way, by basically saying, well, we don't need to kind of make up any kind of devices in the mind or anything that help us generate language, hence this generative idea. The reason why it's called cognitive is basically all of our cognitive abilities are sufficient to explain what language can do. So our ability to chunk, to put, looking at this number of bottles, I can very quickly, without even much cognitive effort, think, oh yeah, there's a number of bottles here. I can chunk this into units. We do this with language all the time. Small kids do it at a very young age, quite quickly. Just from listening to an utterance, we cannot tell the words apart. We don't leave pauses between words or anything, and kids can tell them apart. And usually correctly. It's just funny if they don't do it correctly. And then things like memory and pattern recognition, all those cognitive abilities we as humans have, and basically cognitive linguistics argued, in my opinion, quite convincingly, that they're sufficient to explain what's going on. So you've got those three theoretical ones. Here the qualitative modeling, I'm going to explain in a second what this exactly is. But on this side, we're basically coming to the methods that are then needed for this kind of research, and the methods that I have applied over recent years in kind of a number of projects. Now this one we can move forward because now I've saved some time. All right, so we're just going through those. That's why I spent a little more time on this first slide. We're going to go through those now fairly quickly. Complex adaptive systems. Reason why it's called system is, it's systematic. So things are connected to one another. It has multiple components, that's why it's a complex system, multiple variables involved, and it's very often called dynamic, and a dynamic system is basically a really nice word for a process. It's a system that constantly changes in many ways. That's all a dynamic system really is. Why does it change all the time? Because it has more than one variable involved, and these variables interact with one another through the different actors, agents in the system, well, it changes. The variables change. They are dynamic too. And most of those systems go through an iterative process. Think of language learning. We keep doing, or the students in most cases, keep doing the kind of smallest level and unit of analysis. Keep doing actually essentially the same thing time and again. You know, think of some simple little activity, fill in the blank activity. Essentially what it is, they fill in the blank time and again. And so those processes, of course, each and every one of them is slightly different to the others, but they're also self-similar. And that's what's meant by iteration. So it's not just a stepwise process. We keep doing the same thing and go through different iterations. Because of these iterations, it is particularly the initial conditions, however minute they are, that matter the most. For the simple reason, they will, by definition, go through most iterations because they've been around long enough. It's the same thing that happened in language history, basically. If you look at the words in any kind of language, I would think, certainly in any language I know, that any word that has been around for a long time, activities humans have always done, like go, eat. If you just look at the verbs, those are your strong verbs. They have kind of unusual conjugation paradigms. Why? Well, humans had most time to change them because they've been around for so long. They went through so many iterations, and it's the same in most processes, basically. Now, what are we doing with this kind of research based on this theoretical approach and paradigm? We're looking for change. Yeah, I'm trying to study second language development. And what I'm most interested in is those phases when something changes, a variable changes. But change is in this kind of theoretical concept, is a neutral word. Doesn't necessarily mean change for the better or for the worse. And also, when things ostensibly stay the same, they're still changing because of these iterations. They might just kind of repeat themselves, and it looks like nothing changes, but something has changed. That's what we always look at. So now, you can then, of course, because these are processes, you can kind of measure the variables and kind of plot this in a time series graph, for example. You can also plot them in what is called a phase space portrait. So normally in a time series, on the y-axis, you have the value you've measured. Whatever the variable is, you're measuring. And the x-axis is usually time. That's how you construct a time series graph. And then this goes up, it's still nonlinear, and you plot your variable, how it develops, whatever their knowledge of x, their proficiency in y, or something like that. In the phase space, you have the same data, exactly the same data points, but you plot them differently. On the x-axis, you plot this variable at the time n, whatever n is, so every single time. And on the y-axis, you plot them at time n plus 1. And that basically helps you to create change. The butterfly you saw on my initial kind of title slide is one of those phase space portraits. That's why the curve can go in these funny circles. Yeah, time doesn't go in circles, at least not how we measure it physically, but the change does. And on those plots then, on those diagrams, you will have states in which the system is more often. Or if you want to, it's the kind of black spots because you get the graph going through there plenty of times. Those are attractors. The system, these are all metaphors, is attracted to that particular point. Sometimes it's a point, sometimes it's a whole basin where it ends up. Now, what does this tell us about the system? Well, the system needs more energy, often from the outside, in order to leave that state. Now, how do we get energy into a learning process? Through teaching. This is a teachable moment. There is something happening there. So if students, if you want to get stuck somewhere, that is an attractor in that development, because the system kind of keeps going there. One-word utterances in a teacher group dialogue. Yeah, the teacher asks an elaborate question, then points at one student, and the student comes up with a one-word answer. That's one of those attractors, because students are genuinely attracted to that stage in kind of foreign language learning. One-word sentences, basically, in these kind of dialogue answer games. On the other hand, we've got, in these diagrams, white space. So spaces on the diagram, the graph never went through. Theoretically, of course, it could have gone there, but it never did. Empirically, we didn't find any evidence that it ever went there. Now, what does this tell us? We don't need to do anything about it. It's a kind of error students never make. To give you one example, you're just grading an essay or some other text production piece. And, well, in German they use the incorrect article for, let's take Mutter. So mother. Linguistically speaking, because it's about determiner noun agreement within a noun phrase. A computer, being a computer, a dumb number crunching machine, will basically start reasoning, thinking, well, something is wrong here, the agreement doesn't work. Now, if agreement doesn't work, as we all know from families and friends and things like that, it can be either side or both. So either the determiner is wrong or the noun is wrong. That's a theoretical possibility. As we all know in language learning, it never happens, or hardly ever. Yeah, they knew they wanted to talk about their mother for whatever reason and got that word there. They will have, it's very, very likely that they use the incorrect determiner article. It's highly unlikely that they use the incorrect noun. Theoretically possible, highly unlikely. And that's one of those repellers, basically. Can you move it forward, Christopher, again? I think we've screwed up my timing now. Now, this is, as I said, this complex systems theory is basically metaphors, approaches, and then kind of some derived methods from that to understand processes in general, to be able to focus on change and things like that. Now, as I said, we need a theory, and here we take a theory of mind, this activity theory. Particularly in North America, there are a couple of other labels that are used. It's also called sociocultural theory. Why that? Vygotsky, the kind of father of this whole kind of paradigm, research paradigm, and mainly in psychology, but also kind of cognate areas, he called it cultural historical activity theory. That was his terminology. That's how he described his endeavor, basically. Why cultural? Well, because as this complexity theory, there's a lot of emphasis on context. Context is not ignored, it's not reduced, it's not kind of pushed aside, eliminated through experimental design or statistical procedures and tests. No, you look at it, it is important. Why cultural? Because learning for Vygotsky and within activity theory or sociocultural theory is a social activity. It happens at two different planes. It happens at the plane, at the individual plane, basically. Of course, there's something going on in our mind, otherwise we wouldn't call it learning. But it always also happens between subjects in meaningful social interaction. Anyways, that's also the only way you can, according to Vygotsky, explain it. If you're familiar with kind of psychology of especially learning psychology and developmental psychology of the 20th century, the other proponent of still a constructivist paradigm, that knowledge gets constructed, so kind of anti-behaviorist in a way, was Piaget, the Swiss scholar. But for him, it was only, learning was only an individual activity, only happened in the mind. And Vygotsky died very young, but Piaget had lots of arguments with Leontiev and other scholars. There's one interesting one which always kind of hit home with me. Leontiev, basically one of the kind of disciples, followers of Vygotsky, meets with Piaget at a conference, and Piaget says, well, you know, kind of, you're doing all this complicated stuff and my theory is much better. And I can kind of explain all those things. And we don't need your entire apparatus. We don't need the social plane in order to explain those things. That was his argument. To which Leontiev said, and he said, well, I agree. You can explain things really well. You can explain what is. What my theory can do is also explain what will be and what can be, what the potential is. And there's lots of concepts and terminology. Zone of proximal development is probably the kind of best known one, where you do exactly that. You do this in assessment, you do this in many, many other areas. The other thing is, I realized the slide has already moved. You remember the triangle at the bottom? No, don't go back, it's good. Is in activity theory, in this activity system, and that was what the triangle was for, all the different actors and components of that system are very clearly labeled. It's a bit like a recipe book. It's that theory that helps one to, whatever the kind of project is, to then look and say, how am I going to analyze this process? How am I going to analyze complex management of a company, the learning in a classroom, the interactions at a departmental meeting or whatever, any kind of activity basically, and you go through that triangle, and certainly in descriptive terms, can quite easily then say, okay, who's the subject here? What are the mediating artifacts? What's the object? Object is basically another word for goal in this particular case, more like objective. What are the rules of the game? What is the community surrounding this, and so on? So you can quite easily analyze the different components of the system in a systematic and well-informed and well-founded way. Oops, now I was a little bit, yes. This is the language part. I've already, here I don't need to say that much. Construction grammar is one of those flavors of cognitive linguistics that I was talking about earlier. Why did I take this one? Very simple. The word construction is so neat, isn't it? When I was a student, we already used this in my kind of study of German, basically. In German grammar, we always had things like, oh, here's an infinitival construction. Here's a kind of extended infinitival construction. Here's a participle construction. And we use the word construction all along, independent of what the theoretical paradigm was. In construction grammar, construction is the main unit of analysis. And constructions are basically, they can be of various sizes. So size of a morph, size of a word, size of a sentence, and some linguists would argue even larger than a sentence. So it goes also well beyond our kind of older understanding of grammar in the narrow sense. This is not just the structure of sentences. Grammar is much more. It's just a kind of structuring criterion, basically. And what are they? They're conventionalized. So these are conventions in a particular speech community that we might want to call, well, German speakers or something like that. Conventionalized form meaning mappings. That is nothing new. We've had these kind of things in structuralism since de Saussure, basically, the kind of form meaning mapping in some way. What is very new here is the understanding of what form and meaning stand for. Form is, yes, it's a kind of written form as for de Saussure, the spoken form as for de Saussure, so the material side of the construction in this case. But it is the grammar. It is also what we traditionally call the pragmatics. So the kind of conventions of use, which very, very often, as we all know, go well beyond any kind of grammatical rule we can ever come up with. Because then we kind of play into things like persuasiveness, politeness, and whatever. That part, and that's why I can spend less time on this particular slide, that part I explained already at the very beginning. what is most interesting and, in my opinion, kind of most important for our approaches in the classroom in general, anything to do with language, whether this is in a kind of cultural studies class, in a lit class, or in a kind of straightforward kind of language training class, is this idea that this kind of linguistics, this kind of grammar, is usage-based. It's not a generative grammar, which means the use is there first. The grammar is secondary, is post hoc. And that is also so for our learners. Certainly when you think about first language acquisition, we start using the language first as tiny little kids, toddlers or something. And then, because of our cognitive abilities, we start chunking, we start recognizing patterns, we generalize over these patterns, we abstract from these patterns and derive new, more abstract constructions, which we then might want to call, the example I had earlier, determiner-noun agreement, or we call them subject-verb agreement, or we call them a ditransitive verb, or whatever label we might later on then have for those abstract constructions that we have, and we have knowledge of. That's how we decode language very often. That's how we decode newly formed words in a language. That's why when a verb like to Google enters the German language, German speakers know immediately how to conjugate that verb in German. There's no problem at all having a past participle, having a second person singular in present tense and stuff like that. And we do this because of our knowledge of abstract constructions. That, in my opinion, has huge implications, of course, how we approach language learning. We cannot necessarily forefront rules and then have students generate utterances. We have to help them use the language, focus their attention on particular constructions, and help them work through these different cognitive processes as quickly as they possibly can because they have so little time. Okay, now we can. Thank you, Chris. Good to have you in the back there. This is about the method. So this was kind of some theoretical legs to stand on. What happens? Would you like to come in? Yes, please do. I already said the overall approach is very qualitative. The theories in research, in my opinion, get used well for two reasons, and you can also evaluate them in some way. Are they kind of good theories, suitable theories or not? And that's very often, in most cases, done on a basis of predictive power. How great is the predictive power of a particular theory? Of these complex systems, because they are nonlinear and they are so complex, the predictive power is very, very low. We find it, think of weather forecasting. We still have, after about 100 years of recording the weather and thinking about meteorology, doing all this complex system stuff, they still have a very hard time, and I'm sure they're properly trained, a very hard time forecasting the weather for any longer than kind of 24 hours roughly. Because, well, it's the predictable power of predictability that is relatively low. Where this power is very great is explanatory power. I can use this theory to explain quite a lot that I cannot otherwise explain adequately. How is this done? And that's what Dernier proposes, who is in applied linguistics. Says, well, you start off from the end. It's a bit like this butterfly effect thing. And I'll use that example because it's so pertinent. There's this idea of a butterfly, kind of flap of the wings, having started a storm. Butterfly is somewhere in Mexico and the storm is in Texas. That's this whole butterfly story. Now, you can, of course, not observe a butterfly flapping its wings and then predict the storm in Texas. That will never work, I believe. And it certainly has not worked. And Lawrence never made that claim. He made the claim the other way around. He observed the storm in Texas and then traced it back through the various states of what happened with the weather pattern. And there was one kind of minute initial condition in this story, was the flap of the butterfly's wing. And kind of eventually, at the very end, could trace it back there and think, oh, that was this very initial condition, and it didn't matter because it upset something else in the balance, and then this happened, and then this thing came together, or whatever. It was this so-called perfect storm, basically, in this story. Now, things very often, if you reflect on your own teaching, on your own learning in some way, seem to have happened in a very similar way. When we look kind of in hindsight, we look back, we sometimes are able to find out how come we are where we are now. We arrived at a stage where we are now. Through what states did we go through? Through what states? Of course, you can do this in language learning. Through what states did the learners go through? I said there's a lot of emphasis on context. You're basically trying to look at the whole system. It's not reductionist research, as is done in many kind of quantitative studies, experimental studies, and some of those statistical tests and things like that. It's not like that at all. But who can do that? Who can look at everything, basically? Yeah, you have a group of language learners, let's just say it's just 10 people. You observe them for a longer period of time, because that's also necessary to kind of check development. So let's say term or whatever, video record them, and then kind of try to get all sorts of data points and information about them. Now, how do you make sense of all these different variables that might or might not play a role? And that would include things like room temperature and the lighting and whatever, not just their motivation and their prior learning and whatever things we very often look at. How do you do that? You look for collective variables. They're very well defined in the natural sciences. Basically, a collective variable is a fairly robust configuration of smaller variables. It would be something like proficiency. That is a collective variable. Yeah, there are lots of things within proficiency, of course, as we know, but it's relatively robust. And I can operationalize it. I can measure proficiency as this large variable. And these variables have a particular kind of trait. They're indicative. They're telling about the system. It's a little bit of this, the intuitive, subjective part in this kind of research, by picking them and selecting them, and then you try it out, basically. But once you have a genuine collective variable that is really relevant to that process, to that dynamic system you're looking at, this one variable tells you something about how the system is moving, how it is developing. So these are terribly important to look at. And as I said, the one I'm mainly interested in is proficiency. Now, because you're not only looking at context, let's come back to this group of 10 students, you also look at the individual. The individual matters. It doesn't matter what the leveling effects are in especially larger groups or whatever. If I know that, well, the average student does X, it doesn't help me in my kind of teaching at all. It doesn't help me in my advising of a particular student at all, because I have no idea whether, more likely than not, this person in front of me will probably not be an average student. It's very unlikely for somebody to be average, exactly, mathematically speaking, average. So you would want to look at the individual cases basically as is done in qualitative studies. On the other hand, you want to overcome the great weakness of qualitative studies. And a great weakness is generalizability. It's darn hard, based on a qualitative study, particularly of an individual student, to come up with generalizable results. That's very difficult to do. What qualitative studies are very good at is generating very interesting questions. If you want to dig deeper, that's what they're very, very good at. Things that can be then tested, where you don't know before what you should test and things like that. But they're kind of weak, let's say, in this generalizability. Now, well, you know, we're dealing with politics, we're dealing with an educational system or something. It's really sometimes very nice to have generalizable results from research, particularly when you talk about something like proficiency or whatever. So how do you do it? You still look at the individual, but you look at the individual within the group. Again, the context. We had in this particular study, Shulze is a former PhD student of mine. We ended up with a group of 14 students who were observed over 4 months. Kind of intermittently, not the whole time, of course, we are not kind of that bad. And I did those calculations at some stage. 14 people, if you want to compare them always in pairs, you're going to do 91 comparisons, which even for a PhD student is quite tedious. So what do? You find out which ones you really want to look at. And this is funny, these things are called dendrogram. You find out which ones are better to look at than others. And you want to look at the ones, you start off, for example, with P2 and P7, because these two guys are the most similar, according to the variables we measured for this particular study. That's what these dendrograms very quickly, they kind of get generated in seconds, basically, once you feed the data in and have the right program to do it. And this is this pairwise comparison. So you compare the two who are most similar first, and you compare them for their similarities. You're trying to find out why did the machine tell you they're very similar, just by being fed some data. And then you do the qualitative analysis and say, oh, there must be something there. If the numbers are telling me they're similar, because it's a correlation calculation that's underneath all this kind of diagram, you look at and say, okay, what are they really kind of similar at? Did they, both say, oh, I want to be a German major. This is kind of, I'm selecting my program these days. This is what I want to do. Here's my motivation, this kind of thing. Then you do the next one, which could be either this one over here, the P5, P8, or could be the P6, 14. They're kind of very, very similar. So you pick one of those, do the same thing again with this pair, look for similarities, and then you only have to look for differences between the pairs, because there must be also a reason why they didn't end up in the same pair. And that way you basically build a highly individualized profile of this entire group. And after a while, you have a very neat kind of terminating condition. You can stop your analysis by basically saying, we actually stopped it after 4 comparisons. Saying, that's sufficient. We found out what we needed to find out. We looked at, I think it was those two actually, 2 very similar ones, and then we said, no, let's do this differently. Let's kind of look for a larger difference. And I think we took these. Oh, here they are different. Then we went kind of outside of the mass and said, well, this was a study on gaming, computer gaming, basically, used for language learning. We then said, well, let's forget about all this math and machines and whatever. The one thing we do know about this group, this computer maybe doesn't know, is of those 14 students, they were all volunteers and it was extracurricular, only 2 were female. It just so happened because they were self-selecting, but on the other hand, there must have been a reason why I'm kind of simplifying somewhat, why the boys said, oh yeah, I want to play these computer games. And the girls obviously did less so. And there were a couple of other interesting pieces of information from the recruitment which we had, and we could then figure out a couple of things. But we simply then looked also at those 2 female students who had participated in the study and were pretty close to the end and had a good grasp of what had gone on in this entire group of 14 students, basically, by doing those fewer comparisons. Okay, Chris, can I bother you again? This is the study I began to talk about. I don't know whether you're familiar with World of Warcraft. I certainly was not. And my idea of kind of gaming on a computer is still playing cards. That's how old-fashioned I am. And I love doing it, and I won't change it. But this student came to me. He had been an avid gamer in his high school years, perhaps even overly so, kind of close to the kind of trouble threshold, he told me. And for that personal reason, then said, well, I want to find out what's going on there, and I want to find out what this is good for. He was also very passionate about the learning of German, and he said, well, I'd like to combine those two for my PhD project. So the whole idea was, can intermediate to advanced students basically improve their German just by playing a game extracurricularly? Is something going to happen or not? There have been lots of claims in the literature that this is good for you, but hardly any solid empirical evidence, basically. So that's what we set out to do then. So it was extracurricular, extramural. They were pretty much on their own with doing it. We used, or Kyle used, the learning to play paradigm versus a playing to learn paradigm. Both are possible in educational games. Here we have a highly sophisticated commercial off-the-shelf game, internationally extremely popular with a huge following in all sorts of different age groups. Now you might want to argue about the sujet and whatever and the violence in there, and there are all sorts of gender issues with that game. It's highly genderized basically. But it's out there and people do use it and they voluntarily use it. So I very much believe, as a kind of social scientist, well, we better find out why. What's going on there? What's happening? And these students then would play during those 4 months, minimum of 10 hours altogether. That was one of the kind of recruitment criteria. We also paid them a little kind of, well, can hardly call it a fee, a bonus basically, for their participation. And they had to participate in 3 basically monthly conversation sessions, where they then met with the researcher and pretty much talked about the game, various aspects of this gaming, and they did so again in German. And this was no grades, nothing, all genuinely extracurricular. And we then measured, it's called near transfer. We measured the transfer of constructions, most of them lexical, some of them a little bit larger than just a word, from the gaming experience to these conversations. That's why it's near transfer. The contexts are very similar. Yeah, both have to do with gaming. One is playing the game, the other one is talking about the game. Are they able to pretty much reuse, let's just call them words that they can have only learned in the game? We pretty much did a corpus study, finding out, yes, can't be prior learning, they will have not heard this word before, they can't have, or they told us, we also did interviews with them and said, no, I didn't know that word before, I hardly know it now, I just kind of saw it in the game and right to play the game. The interesting things we found, yes, we could provide evidence that under certain conditions, let's not forget these were volunteers, they wanted to play. So if they're motivated to play, if you're using this playing, learning to play paradigm, so it's all about the game. We didn't tell them, oh, you have to learn German when you play this or whatever. No, we said, well, just play World of Warcraft. Be really good at World of Warcraft. Other things will fall into place. And if these debriefing sessions happen, if students have a chance to talk about their experience, and has not only to do with kind of violence in there and kind of genderized, well, images and phenomena in there, it also has to do with this language learning experience, being able to share it with peers in this case. So other students who also played made the whole thing worthwhile already, whereas just kind of sitting at home and playing wouldn't have made it. And there it worked. So it's a very good additional extracurricular things. We could encourage students now and say, well, actually this does work. Yeah, now can you hit it again? Well, I think we're done. Here's just it. This is basically the kind of the research up until now. This was the research trying to explain that I've been doing over kind of the last couple of years. In doing that, I came across this Kinevin, that's how it's pronounced, Kinevin model. Kinevin can hardly be translated into English, but I think it can be quite easily translated into German. It's Heimat in German. And well, as we know, there is no real English word for Heimat. When they do translate Kinevin, it's Welsh, actually, that's because Snowdon is Welsh. Then they translate it as something like habitat, environment. And what the idea is that we are in different contexts. He also uses these complex systems. That's why I'm bringing this up. And I like this example because it always helps me to transfer what I've learned in my research to lots of other kind of problem spaces and areas I also have to deal with. Because this one is very much about problem solving. And what David Snowden's trying to map out is that we are faced with different kind of problems. The other kind of simple problems, kind of the bottom right, where we basically we wake up in the morning, come to the kitchen, there's no coffee. That's a problem. Yeah, we've got state A, i.e. no coffee. We've got a goal state B, we want coffee. And there's a hurdle in between. We have to make coffee. That's a definition of a problem, basically. Now, for those kind of simple problems, we don't even need to think a lot. We don't need to analyze because we've encountered this problem so often. We immediately come up with a solution, which we can then also implement. We just make coffee. Done. Now, as we all know, very few problems are like that. Complicated problems, earlier on, you used to call them linear problems. You basically use a trial and error heuristic. You analyze the problem, how you get from A to B, and you try to find the best solution. And there probably also is a best solution. A specialist would be able to tell you, oh, here's a best solution. This is how you do this. Like, I don't know, you have a blocked sink drain or something like that. If you then call a plumber through trial and error and with their experience, it's a linear problem. You need to unplug this thing, but it's not immediately obvious where the plug is or whatever and what you need to do. But the plumber can figure it out, and there is a best practice for it. Now, Snowden works mainly, he has nothing to do with language learning or anything like that. He is in management training. That's where he discusses those kind of problems and these complex systems and whatever. And he says, well, that's what most managers think. That's what most of us think. Yeah, we work in linear metaphors all the time. We work in linear metaphors in language teaching and learning very, very often. In the 60s, we talked about things like mastery learning. We talk about things like input and output, which sounds very linear to me. But on the other hand, we know things are not linear, but we like them to be. So that's also how we try to solve problems. It's a bit like Trump saying, oh, we've got an immigration problem, which he clearly conceptualizes as a linear problem. Says, okay, I have to find the best solution, which in his opinion is this wall with Mexico. Now, well, I don't want to predict the future, but it's highly unlikely, just in this kind of very abstract sense, that he's going to succeed with that approach because, as we all know, immigration is clearly not a linear phenomenon. So it can't have a linear solution. It's not just Trump, a lot of politicians would need to learn that lesson, I believe. Most of the problems we are facing are complex problems. That's why I'm also so interested in complexity theory. Now, there is no linear solution. There is no best practice. All we can do this, in my opinion, also applies to our kind of daily practice with language learning, any kind of teaching, any interaction with students, really, is we do want to interfere with the students. I mean, that's what teachers do. You kind of want to mingle with things a little, you want to do something, you want to improve things a little, but always a little. And what we should not do is expect a linear, i.e. also a proportionate outcome. Well, I've used twice the time to prepare this lesson. The students better be twice as good. And again, we know it doesn't work that way. So, of course, we prepare better and try something new. Then we observe the change in there. see what's happening. And then, well, people like Diane Larson Freeman, they also talk about embracing change. I'm not with these kind of fuzzy metaphors or whatever. They kind of, and I'm too German for those things. But what we need to do is kind of anticipate that change, not be surprised. Yes, we've just introduced something, we've changed something, we've improved maybe even something. The system is going to change, but something else is going to come up. And we'll have to do this as an iterative process, do this again, kind of go back there and say, okay, system has changed, I'll evaluate it again, let me see, go in there, change something else, maybe change the same thing. Then, of course, also as we know, there are things that are genuinely chaotic. Yeah, chaos theory is just called chaos theory because it looks like chaos. It's not. It's very systematic, actually, and in parts deterministic. Here, of course, there are also things that are generally kind of totally out of whack and totally chaotic. And there, with these problems, it's a Gordian knot, basically. We act first. Kind of hit them hard, hit the problem hard, in order to push them at least into this area, so that we can do something. And preferably into some other areas where we can do something. I think that's good enough. I probably went, because I skipped a couple of slides, I went over time a bit there. Let's finish here. That was just a kind of little outcome. We can do this some other time. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for bearing with me. And I'll